Acts chapter 7. I appreciate you who are here because my competition this morning is unmerciful. Not only is Karen Finch running a class, and she is stiff competition, she's wonderful, but then to make matters worse, there's a bake sale in there. So what are you going to do with something like that? You know, how do you, and they all disappear. How do you compete with a cream puff? I don't know, but anyway, I appreciate you who are manifestly the elect who have found your way into the continuing series that we're doing on the book of Acts. And this morning we are in Acts chapter 7. We weren't here, of course, last week, the congregational meeting. So it's been 2 weeks since we were together. And you may recall at that point we were introducing Stephen, who had been elected one of the deacons, although they're not called deacons at that point, but I think that's probably an apt title for them. And then, of course, Stephen, one of those 7, himself further distinguishes himself as a great preacher, one that God endowed with the power even to do miracles, and he was raising quite a stir, and so much so that he was himself arrested then, the first non-apostle that we hear about in the book of Acts who has that particular pleasant experience and is haled into court before the Sanhedrin and is accused then of the crimes of blasphemy. And it's out of that, of course, that he preaches the sermon, which we find here in Acts chapter 7, at least a summary of it. Acts chapter 7 will demarcate for us the end of the first major section of the book of Acts. I've mentioned this to you before. In Luke's strategy, he's telling us the story of Christianity in Israel. This is a strictly Jewish audience at this point. It's not to say that there were no Gentile converts yet, but Luke isn't concerned about telling us about them because his focus is really the gospel among the Jewish people. This becomes part of his whole agenda, or his apology, as it would be called classically, his defense of the gospel, particularly that rather controversial aspect of New Testament teaching, that the gospel would be as much for the Gentile as for the Jew, that in a sense there's a level playing field now around the world, that there's no preferential status that is accorded the Jewish nation as such. And that, for us it may be not a burning issue. Maybe that's something we more or less take for granted, but certainly in the first century that was the burning issue. That was the biggie. And so we find Luke is continually returning to that, and he wants to begin his discussion by starting with the Jewish side of the Christian story and then working his way out and drawing these connections, connecting the dots for us relentlessly until we're driven to the conclusion that he wants us to reach. In this first section, the first 7 chapters, Luke records for us gives us the account of 3 sermons. So we are coming this morning to the third of those 3. Each of the sermons builds on the other. So Luke is very thoughtful about how he's piecing this together. The first sermon, you'll recall, was in Acts chapter 2. It was precipitated by the events of the day of Pentecost. Speaking in tongues, people gathered, people wondered what's going on. And that sermon is really a detail simply of the gospel itself. Here is the gospel. Jesus lived, he died, he rose again. He was seen, he ascended into heaven, he reigns, he'll come again. The basic structure of the gospel and our need to respond to that in faith. The second sermon is given to us in chapter 3. It is occasioned by the healing of the man who was born lame, you recall. And he's there at the beautiful gate of the temple. He's healed under the ministry of Peter and John. That gives the occasion for the next sermon. And Luke's concern is to help us see now that the gospel does not simply come out of the blue, what lawyers would call de novo, out of the blue or out of heaven, but rather it has a deep history. The gospel is itself rooted in hundreds, indeed thousands of years of history that go before. So the Old Testament is part of our story. The gospel is not some new thing, utterly unprecedented, unexpected, but rather it is that which has been accumulating and in an expectancy throughout all of the Old Testament. That's why, as Christian people, we need to read our Old Testaments. The Old Testament is part of the Bible. And as much as we become familiar with it, it gives texture and depth to our understanding of the New Testament. And certainly the book of Acts gives great testimony to that fact. So it's the expectancy of the gospel in the second sermon. The third sermon now, somewhat similarly, but with a somewhat new emphasis, is going to once again tie the gospel to the Old Testament, but particularly tie it to the great, what we call covenants of the Old Testament. That is, that the gospel is the realization of God's covenant promises. And so Luke is going to give us this report of Stephen's sermon by organizing it around three great moments, which are themselves related to three great persons in the Old Testament. Luke's account of Stephen's sermon is a wonderful refresher course in the Old Testament. This is like the Reader's Digest version, you know. And so you should read it and then go back and read the more detailed account that we find in the Old Testament. But this sort of summarizes in a bird's eye view the Old Testament account. But particularly, Stephen wants to focus on these three great figures. First of all, Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, the one to whom God made the original promises, to Abraham and his seed. And then the second promise is given, as it were, that is a covenant is established with Moses. And so Stephen shifts to Moses. And then third, he's just coming up to David. And just about the time he's going to start talking about David, these who are listening to him become so outraged that they come forward prematurely. He hadn't even given the altar call yet, you see. And they come up and grab him by the nape of the neck and drag him right outside the town and stone him to death. That's how you can tell you've really preached a good sermon, you see, when you precipitate that kind of reaction. You know the audience isn't bored. Of course, it makes for a short career as a preacher, but nevertheless, as they would say, what a way to go with that kind of outrageous reaction to his great sermon. So anyway, we won't get a whole lot of David in the sermon, but we do have something of what he wants to say about Abraham and Moses. This morning, we're going to take the Abraham part of the story, which is the first roughly 17 verses of Acts chapter 7. And then next week, we'll move and take a look at the Moses piece of the story. The great thing that we note about Abraham is that God called him and made promises to him, and those promises were addressed to Abraham and, as it says, to his seed. To his seed, that is, to his descendants. That becomes a crucially important idea in the New Testament. Particularly the question, who are the seed of Abraham? Because whoever they are the ones who are the beneficiaries of the promises to Abraham. And so that was a rather important status to be able to acquire and boast of, as it were, to be the seed of Abraham. Well, what Stephen wants to enforce here and push and argue for is that the true seed of Abraham are those who are of faith, that they are connected to Messiah. And we're going to at least see the beginnings of that story developing in our text this morning. So, let's take a look at this. If you are with me in Acts, it's page 124 in your Pew Bible, if you're using that. And we're looking at the beginning of Acts chapter 7. And we'll be looking at the first 16 verses of Acts chapter 7. Stephen has been arrested. He's been brought in before the Sanhedrin. And now the question is put to him, which gives rise to his opportunity to make a defense. The question then is in verse 1. Then the high priest asked him, "Are these things so?" And Stephen replied, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our ancestor Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Leave your country and your relatives and go to the land that I will show you. Then he left the country of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After his father died, God had him move from there to this country in which you are all now living. He did not give him any of it as a heritage, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as his possession and to his descendants after him, even though he had no child. And God spoke in these terms, that his descendants would be resident aliens in a country belonging to others who would enslave them and mistreat them during 400 years. But I will judge the nation that they serve, said God, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. The patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him from all his afflictions and enabled him to win favor and to show wisdom when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who appointed him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. Now there came a famine throughout Egypt and Canaan, and great suffering, and our ancestors could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our ancestors there on their first visit. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and invited his father Jacob and all his relatives to come to him, 75 in all. So Jacob went down to Egypt. He himself died there, as well as our ancestors, and their bodies were brought back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So there you are. Quick survey. That's 40 chapters of Genesis right there that Stephen has just summarized. And of course, to his audience, this is familiar turf. I mean, these are all familiar, unassailable propositions of history that he is presenting for them. But we want to take a little time to look at some of these details this morning as we go. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, we're grateful for this opportunity again to review the great truths of the gospel in light of the great history of your people. We thank you for Stephen and for the inspired sermon that you equipped him to deliver on this day. We thank you that you've preserved it so that even today, 2,000 years later, we can think about it and learn those things that you have for us from it. We give you thanks, asking your blessing on our conversation now. In the name of Christ. Amen. All right, well, we begin with a question. The question is posed by the high priest, are these things so? The things of which the high priest was asking Stephen, of course, were the accusations that had been brought to bear against Stephen by certain unscrupulous witnesses. So if you were here 2 weeks ago, you recall that Stephen had been accused of blasphemy, which was a capital offense in ancient Israel. And Stephen was then confronted with the evidence supporting that accusation, namely that he had, one, said that this Jesus of whom he preached would destroy this place, and two, that customs that had come down from Moses would be ended. And I suppose Stephen would have to say, on both counts, guilty as charged, but that certainly doesn't add up to blasphemy. We indicated earlier that even Jesus had predicted that your house is left to you desolate. Not one stone will be left upon another. Days of vengeance are coming. This place, which has been the central sanctuary of worship on this planet for so many hundreds of years, is now going to be set aside. The Jerusalem of the past will be dismantled. The temple will no longer be the place where we pilgrimage for worship. God is doing something new. Now that Messiah has come, the old can pass away. The new is with us. And so, in a sense, God is going to facilitate that by actually bringing about the destruction, the termination of Jerusalem, which actually happened in 70 A.D., as you know. And so I'm sure that Jesus, having preached that, it wouldn't have been any surprise that Stephen would have said words to the same effect. And so if the charge was that he was predicting that there would be destruction of this place, mea culpa, he would say, okay, I do that. But that's not blasphemy, because I'm actually saying these very things in order to afford the opportunity for repentance, to let go of the old wineskins and embrace the new, to begin this new journey in the Messianic age, given that Messiah has come. Similarly, we have the same idea with respect to the customs that Moses had given. Certainly Moses had provided a very intricate way of life. Unclean, clean, you see, ceremonial kinds of status and so on, all of the sacrificial program, all of that. Very, very elaborate, but now the time was over. This was no longer necessary, and so those customs would be set aside. Not the fundamental law of ethical conduct, that was never set aside, but all of the sort of external ritualistic side of it, which had characterized Old Covenant Israel, was now going to be done away with. And so Stephen would have to allow, okay, I said those things too. But again, this doesn't add up to blasphemy. This is simply saying that God has opened the door to something new. Well, that's the charge, and so the high priest asked him, are these things so? And Stephen begins then this response, this sermon, and it's in these words, and he starts with a very cordial beginning, brothers and fathers. There's no hint here of a kind of maliciousness on the part of Stephen. Listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our ancestor Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, leave your country and your relatives and go to the land that I will show you. So this is familiar. Certainly if you know the Old Testament, especially the book of Genesis, you know this story well. The God of glory, Israel herself, was the great beneficiary of the glory of God. For example, Paul says in Romans chapter 9, one of the great advantages of Israel was that she had the glory. The glory was entrusted to her. From the Jewish point of view, the glory of God was actually visible, and it resided in the Holy of Holies between the wings of the cherubim over what was called the Ark of the Covenant. And that was where, in their scheme, God's glory resided. But that word glory has a very deep texture to it. It actually is the Hebrew word kabod, which comes from a Semitic root which means weight. It's the weight of God, suggesting the majesty of God. This is the dignity. In fact, the Latin word dignitas is the word that translates that Hebrew word kabod. And it suggests something of God's presence, that we feel His weight, you see. Great glory. It's connected in the Old Testament to the word holy, Qadesh, so that many times you'll find those two words together. Holy, 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 the whole earth is full of His glory. It's a very common kind of connection. As if to say, glory is holiness made visible or palpable. So that when in the Old Testament people experienced glory, it was a holy moment, a moment of the sacred, a moment of the other. And it's that which Stephen uses to describe the moment in which the God of glory now confronts Abraham. Abraham lived probably roughly 2,000, in very round numbers, 2,000 BC. Actually closer to about 1930 BC, but we'll say around 2000. This is in Mesopotamia, which is sometimes called the cradle of civilization. All of our archaeological work has suggested that the first evidence of true civilization is related to Mesopotamia and various dynasties that are related to various cities. So you have Sumer is the first one. You have Acadia is in there. Ison is one of them. But one of the most important of them is called Ur. Ur, which is really toward the southern end, right close to the place where the Tigris and Euphrates unite. and become one stream flowing into the Persian Gulf. You got that in your head, that map there? Well, that's where Ur was, and that's where Abraham lived. And the point is, it was a place of, in that particular region, high civilization. Abraham was living in the capital of the world, so to speak, where things were as good as they got in terms of, level of style of life and so on. And so this is almost, we have a little bit of a subtlety right here, that Abraham is living in a wonderful place. He's not out in the hinterland, but he's in the very center of things, like living in Manhattan, New York City, you see, where business is fast and transactions are happening, and you got Wall Street here and Madison Avenue there, and it's a very, very exciting place to be. And we have the impression Abraham was pretty well off and his family was well off. And then this voice comes to him and says, Abraham, I want you to leave. Leave the center of the universe. Leave the place where everything is exciting and everything is, really, you're right at the hub, the nerve center of what life is all about. I want you to leave, and I want you to go to a place, and I'm not going to tell you yet where it is. I just want you to take off. And that really becomes a paradigm for us, doesn't it, of the life of faith. Isn't that just typical? Just when you think things are really coming together, God says, now I want you to leave. That's why we call it a journey of faith. And sometimes the journey is going somewhere and we have no clue where. And it's that feeling sometimes of journeying into the darkness, but the promise we have is God is always with us. And so Abraham, right there, catches a glimpse of something transcendently superior to Ur of the Chaldees, namely the God of glory. You see. And how does the glory of Ur compare to the glory of God? It doesn't. And so Abraham, in that moment of faith and courage, submits, and he follows. And that's how the whole story of Israel begins. That this man of faith responds in obedience to the God of glory and is willing to go on a pilgrimage leading him out of town, never to return. And so we have that. God of glory appeared to Abraham. Go to a land I will show you. Verse 4. Then he left the country of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. Haran, if you know your geography, was actually north. If you look at the two rivers, of course, Tigris to the east, Euphrates to the west, the region between them is called Meso, between Potamia, from Potamus, the rivers. So between the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates is Mesopotamia. And he's journeying up the sort of left-hand side of that, the westerly river, the Euphrates, up around a couple of 100 miles to a place that was then called Haran, another major city, and he stays there for some time. And he has his father with him, and we have then this, after his father died, God had him move from there to this country in which you are now living. So he journeyed from there, then westerly and southerly, down toward the coast of the Mediterranean into what we now call Palestine. And so it was kind of a up north, back down to the south journey that Abraham undertakes at that point as God directs him so to do. He did not give him, however, verse 5, any of it. He calls him to this land, but he leaves his nice home to become a nomad, to live in tents, you see, there. He didn't give him any of it, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as his possession and to his descendants, or the word traditionally is his seed, after him, even though he had no child. So Abraham arrives here. God doesn't give him any of this great land personally. He doesn't stake off so many acres and say, okay, Abraham, that's yours. He lives, as was not uncommon in that day, as a nomad. He's very wealthy. Abraham was a wealthy man. In fact, by normal standards, as we compare his situation with contemporary evidence of that region and that time, he was fabulously wealthy. But he doesn't own any land. You see, there's nothing that's given to him in that regard. But he does have a promise. So we have the promise that is made to Abraham and his seed, his descendants. Now this becomes an extremely important idea, that we find traced throughout the Bible, Old and New Testaments. There is an idea here that the seed of Abraham is rather complex and multifaceted. So there is, in a sense, the broad seed of Abraham and the more narrow seed of Abraham, if you will. Or another way to make the distinction, the visible and the invisible, if I can borrow Augustine's distinction. That there was a visible descendancy from Abraham, a community that could trace back visibly, but there was also, as it were, within it, an invisible community. Those truly possessed of the faith of Abraham. Now, they basically coincided. They were like Venn diagrams that basically overlapped, the visible with the invisible, but they were not identical. They were not the same. And all through the Old Testament, we have this interplay between the visible community of Israel and the true Israel who had faith in their hearts. And sometimes the disparity between them became important. These people honor me with their lips, Isaiah complains, but their hearts are far from me. Visibly, they look good, but their hearts are somewhere else, you see. A great indictment of a great deal that passes for worship. We can come and say and do the right things, but our hearts are somewhere else, not there, not present. That visible and invisible, but sometimes they were very much united. But the Old Testament is always looking forward to a time when the seed of Abraham would become the recipient of the promise to Abraham and his seed. So God made a great promise to Abraham that would finally be fulfilled in his descendants. The New Testament becomes very focused here. So, for example, Paul in Galatians tells us that the seed of Abraham, by the way, this is Galatians 3. This is your assignment for this coming week. Read Galatians 3 and 4, but especially 3 on this point. Where Paul says in that statement that God made promises to Abraham and his seed. And then Paul clarifies, he did not say seeds, plural, but seed, singular, you see. And then Paul makes the point that seed is one human being. Christ. Christ is the seed. And the only way that any of us become the seed of Abraham is by being in Christ. And the only way we get in Christ is by faith. And so Paul makes the point, hammers it home, those who are of faith, they are the seed of Abraham and heirs of the promises to Abraham and his seed. It's extremely important from the New Testament. Because this was a hotly controverted point, because obviously the Jewish people regarded Abraham as their father. Jesus says, sorry. You are the father of, or you are the descendants of the ones that you resemble in your character. And Jesus doesn't mince words at that point. You're of your father, the devil. Not Abraham. Abraham rejoiced to see my day. I'm the seed of Abraham. The devil's a liar. You're liars. You have him as your father. Those are fighting words, in case you didn't catch that. That did not score him any points with the Pharisees when he made those kinds of statements. Well, that's the New Testament point of view. The true seed of Abraham are those who have faith and thus find themselves in Messiah, in Christ. The side benefit of that is that if you are in Christ and seed of Abraham, you are the heir of the promises to Abraham. The promise to Abraham, you recall, was a promise, for example, of land. God said to Abraham on one occasion, okay, Abraham, I want you to take a look. As far as the eye can see, north, south, east, and west, I'll give you this land. Sometimes with our tunnel vision, we think that that's restricted to Canaan. It isn't. The whole concept there was, as it were, Abraham, as far as your eye could conceivably see. As if Abraham could see to the north and keep seeing and seeing and seeing and seeing until his eyes came all the way around the planet and hit him in the back of the head. Because what God was giving him there was not simply a land, He was giving him the whole world. See, Romans chapter 4 makes that clear. Paul says that Abraham was the heir of the world, not just the heir of Canaan land, you see. This was a huge gift. And how is he going to give this gift to Abraham? He's going to give it to his seed, Messiah. So Messiah can rightly say, all authority is given to me. Go make disciples of the nations, because all the nations are mine. Thank you very much. I've inherited the whole thing. You are my emissaries to take that good news to the world, because that promise was a promise of everything. That's how big the promise was to Abraham and his seed. And so we have this reminder that comes to us from Stephen as he's reminding them that God made that promise. Verse 7, he didn't give Abraham any of that land, but the promise that he would give all of it and all the rest beside to him and his seed is accented here. Verse 6, God spoke in these terms that his descendants would be resident aliens in a country belonging to others, who would enslave them and mistreat them during 400 years. So as we begin to trace the history of Abraham's descendants now, in the broad sense, remember broad sense, narrow sense. So in the broad sense now, the descendants of Abraham, the children, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, they are subjected to abuse. This is another point that I think Stephen is wanting to get across to his audience, is that all through the Old Testament, the true seed were abused. They were constantly being persecuted. They were constantly being harassed by some who passed themselves off as the seed and who really weren't. I think Stephen was trying to help these people understand, don't you see? You're doing the same thing today. Just as you're persecuting this church, just as you're persecuting me, Peter, the apostles, the gospel, don't you see you're doing the very same thing that's happened throughout history? Wake up. Recognize that, you are unwittingly just reinforcing the very thing that's been going on all through the years. Persecuting, condemning, upsetting, attacking God's seed as it came down through Abraham. So God spoke in these terms. His descendants would be resident aliens in a country belonging to others. They would mistreat them 400 years. It's a little side point here. I think it's a common conception for folks that look at the Old Testament to think that Israel was enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. This is a technical point. So this is for you Old Testament chronologists. Little footnote here. But it's just, I have to toss it in because it may be of interest to you. There is this idea that Israel was in Egypt for 400 years. From Joseph, you recall, who brings everybody down into Goshen, to Moses, who liberates them. Probably not 400 years. That really, we just can't quite square that with any, reconstruction of ancient history. Probably closer to about 215 years was the time that Israel was in Egypt. It is true that Stephen says here 400 years. But it's likely what Stephen has in mind is a 400-year time period beginning with the birth of his first true descendant, Isaac, the child of promise. And if you add up those numbers, it does come out to be about 400 years from the birth of Isaac until the exodus from Egypt, you see. So that's the 400 years. That's why Paul will say in Galatians again that the promise was made to Abraham and it was not abrogated by the law that was given through Moses 430 years later. You with me here? Because 430 years was the length of time from when God made the promise to Abraham. 430 years. 400 years, Isaac is born. 400 years later, the Exodus. There's a primer on Old Testament chronology right there. So that's what this 400 years is referring to. Not 400 years in Egypt, but 400 years from the birth of Isaac down to the Exodus. Okay, but, continuing, I will judge the nation that they serve, said God, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place. So God says that even though there's going to be this persecution, eventually God would judge Egypt, and the plagues and the whole story of the Exodus, of course, gives us the account of that. They come out of Exodus, they cross the Red Sea, probably what's called the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the eastern branch of the Red Sea that reaches up into Arabia there, that region. And so they come out at that point. And so we have he judges the nation, then in verse 8, I will give him, or I gave him, the covenant of circumcision. Covenant of circumcision. And of course, circumcision in the Old Testament represents now the visible mark of being the seed of Abraham. So as we were saying a minute ago, you have the invisible and the visible. Well, the visible mark, the sign that you belong to Abraham, was this sign of circumcision, replaced presumably in the New Testament by baptism, which becomes a visible mark. No absolute guarantee of the presence of faith. At least from a Presbyterian point of view, we don't teach parents that if you baptize your infant, then automatically that infant is going to be saved. Don't worry about it. No. What that means is that this child is going to be reared as a Christian. We're going to bring this child up into the faith, but we're going to educate that child zealously. We're going to do everything we can to try to bring that child to the point that that child will own the faith that was signified by their baptism. We believe God does something very good for them, but that nevertheless there is a response of faith that must, come along at some point along the way. And similarly with circumcision. So he gave him circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac, circumcised him on the 8th day. And because we think that there's a connection between baptism and circumcision, look at Colossians chapter 2, probably one of the best texts on that, although there are others. We believe that because circumcision was applied to infants in the Old Testament, we have then a good precedent to apply baptism to infants in the New. That's not the entire argument in favor of infant baptism. It's just one piece of it. But it's part of why the vast majority of Christians in history have baptized infants, because we believe that there's a parallel that follows the Old Testament practice of circumcision. I'm very aware that in this room there are some Baptists. You see, so I'm not trying to club you over the head with anything. I grew up a Baptist myself, and so I realize there's a lively, legitimate debate on the issue of baptizing infants. I'm just saying, here's at least how the discussion proceeds from a Presbyterian point of view in part, that we see that connection between circumcision and baptism. They are both initiatory rites by which a person is visibly marked as a member of the visible covenant community. We are very cautious to say this doesn't guarantee salvation of the soul. We believe we have to be extremely diligent to teach and lead children to a point of true, authentic, personal, individual faith. But that they will be reared as a Christian and marked as a Christian is a highly appropriate thing to do. So, anyway, that's at least how that discussion to some degree proceeds. So, Isaac is circumcised on the 8th day. Isaac became the father of Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. This is great stuff, I know you may be bored to tears, but this is really, these stories in the Old Testament are just wonderful, and especially this story of Joseph now. If you haven't read that lately, you should go back. Genesis 40 to 50. Just read that. It doesn't take that long. And it just is gripping drama. Just get yourself into it. But again, Stephen gives us the real quick version of it here. And let's just review this again as he's trying to emphasize now persecution of the true seed, and yet God's covenant promises being faithfully protected. That's really the dual theme that's going on here. So verse 9, the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. But God was with him. This is another occasion where God sent Joseph somewhere he didn't want to go. You talk about a journey of faith. This was it. He did not want to be a slave. He did not want to go to Egypt. But his jealous brothers, persecuting, as it were, the heart of true faith, sold him off into Egypt. Joseph, of course, was the preferred son. That is, he was the favorite. He was the son of Rachel, the favored wife of Jacob. The other son was Benjamin. And so those two were sort of specially treated. It was the coat of many colors, and then Joseph has these dreams that his brothers would bow down before him, and that's all they could take. I mean, that just pushed him over the edge. They said, away with this kid. They sell him, and he goes down to Egypt, and they assume never to be heard from again. And of course, then it says God was with him, rescued him from all his afflictions, and enabled him to win favor and show wisdom when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And there's just mountains of stuff, of course, in those few words, as again, most of you are probably aware. Joseph winds up in Egypt. He's sold off the auction block to an official of Pharaoh's household named Potiphar. He's sold in there as nothing but a slave, but he distinguishes himself so singularly for his integrity and competence that he gradually moves his way up to the very supreme position among the servants in this very wealthy household. And it seems like things are improving when all of a sudden he's the victim of a seductive effort on the part of Potiphar's wife, which Joseph rebuffs and escapes, but she is so upset that he has repelled her that she accuses him falsely of having attacked her, which winds him back up in prison. Isn't that a great story? Wow. And so just about the time he thought things were going well, there he is right back in the dungeon. And you would think he would have thrown in the towel at that point, said, enough of this faith business. What is it getting me for my trouble? But no, Joseph is still faithful. He still distinguishes himself and gradually, of course, moves up again and becomes the chief prisoner, as it were. He's given by God the ability to interpret a couple of dreams, one of the baker, one of the butler. The dreams turn out to be correct. A couple of years later, because of that, Joseph winds up in front of Pharaoh himself to interpret a dream in which Pharaoh had seen this image of famine following feast. 7 years of feast, plenty. 7 years of famine. Pharaoh believes Joseph got it right, puts him in as the prime minister. So, 3 lines here from Stephen just covers immense, story in the Old Testament. And I hope you'll take the opportunity to look at that more closely than I could do justice here. But anyway, we have Pharaoh then appoints Joseph to that position, makes him the ruler over Egypt. Now, verse 11, there came a famine throughout Egypt and Canaan, and great suffering, and our ancestors could find no food. Back home on the ranch, Jacob, the other patriarchs who had sold Joseph, are now facing serious problems because famine is sweeping through that region, and so it's difficulties. And they hear, Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, so he sent our ancestors there on their first visit. This is another great story, because here come the 10 brothers now. They left the little one home. Benjamin stayed home. 10 brothers show up. They don't know that this is Joseph, who's now the prime minister of Egypt. They have no idea why they're being treated so harshly by this guy. But he's accusing them of being spies. I mean, it's payback time. Joseph says, you gave me a little grief, I'm going to give you a little grief, you guys. And so before he discloses his identity, he accuses them of all these crimes. He keeps Simeon hostage, sends back the others, says, don't even come back there unless you bring that alleged younger brother Benjamin with you, because Joseph wanted so much to see his beloved younger brother that was his full brother. And that whole story is wonderful as well. And then, then in verse 13, on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to the brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. And so all of that is really wonderful reading. And all of it is to remind us, why is Stephen saying all this? To show that the people of God who truly possess the faith are constantly hitting bumpy roads. So if you are, pursuing a life of faith and you find the road is bumpy, that's a good sign. It's okay. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. Probably if you find the road is absolutely smooth, that may be trouble, you see, because broad is the way and all of that leads to... But no, it's a narrow gate. It's a straight path. It's a difficult, bumpy road, but God is with you, and you have some sense that in spite of the bumps, God is there carrying you along. And so even now, Stephen, as he's preaching this sermon that will wind up in his own execution, he can preach with great confidence knowing that this is the way God has been working through history and hoping these people will recognize that they themselves are the instruments of this persecution and recognizing it, turn from it and come to Messiah. So, all of this is hopefully reminding them of that. Verse 14, Joseph invited his father Jacob and all of his relatives to come to him, 75 in all. So Jacob went down to Egypt. He himself died there as well as our ancestors. It's interesting, by the way, the people of God, Jacob and his family, the 75, moved down, and as you know, they became residents of a region called Goshen. Goshen is in what's called Lower Egypt, which is actually northern Egypt, but lower elevation, right there in the Nile River Delta. It's a very lush area, and there's always been some question, do we find any trace of the people of Israel, of Jacob and his descendants living in that region in that time frame? And it's interesting, fairly recently there have been some discoveries there that are very intriguing. Homes that have been uncovered which definitely are architecturally designed along Canaanite style rather than Egyptian style. They're very different, very noticeable, conspicuous difference. And so there has been some evidence that you had a fairly significant community that lived there for a period of time that fits right into that time frame, which again becomes an interesting corroboration externally of the story of the Old Testament as reported here in the New. And while I'm on the subject, I might just mention to you, if you're interested in a little bit more exploration of that point, Dr. Steve Meyer, whose name many of you know, he's a professor of philosophy at Whitworth College, was involved in producing a video. He wrote the script for it. He doesn't show up in it, but he wrote the script for it, which was entitled The Exodus Revealed in Search of the Red Sea Crossing. It's about an hour-and-a-half documentary showing how they've uncovered a great deal of interesting data there in Goshen and also traced what was likely the course of the Exodus and actually traced it to a particular location there on what's called the Gulf of Aqaba. They've sent down divers, looking for chariots and that kind of stuff, And while there's a whole lot of coral down there, it is odd. You have this very strange. In fact, one of the divers said, you look at this coral, it's absolutely strange. It's not like any coral reef I've ever seen. It looks more like a junkyard. And it's just all kinds of stuff strewn miscellaneously across this little isthmus there. And if that was, in fact, the location of the Exodus, then it gives wonderful, sort of documentary evidence of that. Unfortunately, the laws prohibit removing any of the coral, so all we can do is look at photographs of it under the water. But if you are interested in seeing that video, I don't get any kickbacks for this. I'm just urging you to do it if you have any interest in this. You could call Whitworth, ask for Steve Meyer, and he'd be happy, I'm sure, to tell you how to do that. I'm not going to loan you my copy, so forget it. Don't even go there. But it is a great video, and it's a lot of fun to watch, and it gives us some of the background of some of the things we're looking at here. So anyway, we have that they lived there probably for about 215 years. After that, of course, under the Exodus and Moses, their very bones are taken from Egypt back to the Promised Land, back to Canaan. They're buried at Shechem, which was the only plot of land owned by Abraham. The only thing he owned in Canaan was a cemetery, where he buried his beloved Sarah, where he himself was eventually buried, and where the patriarchs were buried as well. Next week, we shift now to the next part of the sermon where Stephen moves away from the story of Abraham and his immediate descendants to the story of Moses and the Exodus, and so we'll pick up with it at that point. Thank you. All right, let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we are grateful for the champions, the heroes of faith that we find teaching us all through the history of your dealings with your people. We thank you for Abraham. We thank you for Stephen, who had the courage to preach the sermon that would wind up in his own death, and yet how that sermon rings and echoes down through the history of your church to inform even us this morning as we review it. We give you thanks. We ask your blessing on us now and offer all of these things in the name of Christ our King. Amen.